Right, so this is the title of the presentation today, and I have spent quite a few years in consultancy with various FTSE 100 companies, and this is really about my experience and my learning, but actually based on statistics and some data that I want to share with you. And I think I'm really pleased that some of my academic friends who actually have given lectures previously at the BLSI are actually joining us today. So I'm very pleased to say hello to them. As you can see from the title slide and the picture that I use for this presentation, I think there is a severe danger for business to literally disappear in a financial black hole. And I will explain why I think that that is the case. Okay, I want to start with a pretty sort of dour situation. I want to sort of put this into context. So this is one of the best known linguists, philosophers, social commentators, Noam Chomsky, who only 2 days ago has announced that the world is now at the most dangerous moment in human history. And he cites various examples. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I've done a sort of a bit of a word graph in terms of what some of the key issues are. And I think I want to spend a couple of minutes on this because it's quite important for the rest of the lecture. And there's lots of dimensions that, that are sort of converging and coming together, which I think are building up to be the sort of perfect storm. So here we have the US election, and whoever thought it would take quite so long to actually come to a conclusion, and the incumbent still is not conceding defeat and is still believing that he won the election. In fact, he now tells us that he was solely responsible for the vaccine that is now available. So I think that is going to take some time. But we live in unprecedented times. One of the things that I want you to take away from this lecture is that the pandemic is not the cause of our global financial and economic situation. It may be a symptom of it, but as far as I'm concerned, it is not the sole cause of our predicament. And I think that's very important. But the pandemic has shown us that we live in unprecedented times, extraordinary times, way from the norm. And I think the issues we're facing is that who would have ever thought that a Tory right-wing government would actually intervene in the economy and in business to the extent it has. So far, I think the government has spent close to £200 billion on supporting workers, businesses, etc. through the pandemic. That is continuing, and what was going to be a furlough scheme for a period of months has now actually been extended to the end of March, which will cost significantly extra money. We are already feeling the effects of the pandemic economically. I think unemployment has gone up to 4.8%. That's the highest it's been since 2012. And we've also heard from the Bank of England, who have invested, and in terms of quantitative easing, £150 billion or will be into the economy. But these are the sort of the macro factors. We've also experienced resource shortages, issues around supply chains. We've looked at the impact of multinationals in this role, the role they play, and also the impact that digital has had. So really, what I want to do is actually expand on this. So I wanted to bring to bear not just the macro factors, but also the sort of individual business factors. And I believe that business has a key role to play in all this. And rather than keep you waiting to the end in terms of why business needs to change, which is normal practice in these presentations, I thought I'm going to be upfront from the beginning and show you where we need to go in the future in terms of the key areas. Now, here we are. So here are 6 reasons why business must change. Now, I apologize at the beginning. Some of the slides will be rather busy. And the reason why they're busy is because normally I enjoy actually building slides. So they sort of transition and appear one topic at a time. Unfortunately, Zoom is not very friendly to sort of slide transitions. So I've basically had to revert back to having everything on one slide. But hopefully you bear with me, and clearly we can discuss that in the Q&A in more detail if you've got any questions. So the first thing is the economic system of perpetual growth is unsustainable. And I will give some reasons for that and explain that in more detail. Consumerism is driven by increased debt and drives inequality. Resources are limited and under increasing stress. We may all have already passed the climate change point of no return, number 4. Social inequality, its effects and intolerance are escalating. And then finally, multinational organizations wield more power and influence than most nation states. So this is the situation. These are the reasons why the current situation is unsustainable, and business has an increasing role to contribute to a positive future, which currently existing business models don't seem to encourage or support. So we start off, and this is economic growth. As you can see, this is quite recent. This is the latest World Economic Outlook for the world, given by the IMF. It's only in October 2020. And clearly, the predictions are for 2020 are dire, and we know that, some countries are experiencing double-digit decreases in GDP, and the situation is relatively the same in all the different continents. I think Asia and developing Asia, including China, are predicting a less of a decline and more of a bounce back in 2021. Having said this, this was the IMF forecast in October. I think the Bank of England has come out only a week ago to actually predict that economic growth forecast for the UK seems to suggest that the positive growth is not going to return in 2021, but will actually have to wait till 2022. Now, clearly, what impacts the discovery of the vaccine that has been announced and the speed of rollout that will be occurring will obviously change this. But I think the key areas I would like you to take away from this particular slide is that the pandemic is a symptom but not a cause of our economic situation, that debt has reached record heights and continues to increase. The core resources are dwindling and shortages are apparent, and not just in everyday supply chains, but actually the absolute supply of core resources, that some of them which actually facilitate new technologies, for example, rare earth metals, lithium, for example, etc. And the one thing I would like you to consider is that GDP as a binary measure of success is really not sufficient to describe the state of an economy, the state of a business, the state of a global market. Okay, I think the first things to consider, second thing to consider is that the world is drowning in debt. And this slide is very busy, so I'm going to try and walk you through it at a sort of relative slow pace. If you go to the graph here on the right-hand side, it shows that currently the debt burden, global debt burden, is $258 trillion in Q1 2020, and that represents a ratio of 335% to GDP. So basically, we are indebted to the tune of more than 3 compared to the global GDP income. Now that is significant, and the reason why I have put in the other graphs is relatively straightforward. So here is a graph on the left-hand side, if you can see that, by McKinsey, which I used a few years ago, which sort of tracked the significant increase in global debt from 87 trillion in 2000, to 142 trillion in 07, and 199 trillion in 2014. And then splitting it down by sector. Now, clearly, we are interested here in terms of business, in terms of financial and corporate debt, which has increased significantly. But that was to 2014. Now, the IMF has a similar chart. This is actually the percentage ratio of debt to GDP. And you can see that when the financial crisis happened here in 2008, we had a sharp increase in debt and then somewhat leveling out over the next years to 2014, 2015, according to this graph. But please note, and this is important, that even at that rate, after the debt crisis of 2008, the ratio was 220% was debt to income, to GDP. Yeah, and now we are now at 330 plus of GDP. So the debts have continued to increase. I wouldn't say exponentially, but have increased at a geometric rate, which I think is particularly worrying. Now, this graph here doesn't split it down into the various sectors, but if you go to the bottom chart here, it is very clear in terms of the total debt. So here, down here on the right-hand side under total, in Q1 2020, you see a total debt of 258 trillion. And I suppose that is Q1 2020. So this really is prior to the full impact of the pandemic. So one would imagine that government debt in particular is going to increase even further. I do want you to have a quick look, though, at the individual sectors, because what is worrying is that all the sectors seem to be increasing. So here we have the financial sector, which represents a big chunk of the total, has increased to 64.3 trillion. We then have government debt, which is also increased to nearly 70 trillion. I presume that will increase significantly more over the coming months. And then we've got non-financial corporates who also have increased their debt burden to 75.6 trillion. And then households, again, have increased their debt. So the message of this slide really is that the world is drowning in debt, and it affects every single sector, not just the domestic sector, but corporates and financial sectors are playing a significant part in this and account roughly for half the global debt. The next thing, so so far we've talked about GDP and we've talked about debt. The next thing now is to actually talk about consumption. And I think this is a key element where our current business practices are not sufficient to sustain a sustainable future. On the left is a graph in terms of the increase in annual water demand between 2005 and 2030. And as you can see, by far the sort of biggest increases are going to be in Africa, India, and Asia, with China. And what is worrying is that actually this isn't domestic increase. These are significant increases in agriculture, where water is in demand, and in industry. Now that has significant impacts on the availability of water in the next 10 to 12 years. So the estimation here by the European Environment Agency is that in only 10 years' time, a third of humanity will have insufficient access to water for their basic needs. And clearly, one of the factors that needs to be added to this is the ever worsening view by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change in terms of the acceleration of climate change. Now, even when you consider making projected improvements in terms of the water supply, the outcome is that currently projected by the European Environmental Agency, we face a 60% gap in water supply, which means we haven't leveraged the current technologies to improve either productivity or the technologies to use to harness water more effectively. Now, that 60% gap equates to 2,000 billion cubic meters of deficit in the future, which is significant, and clearly we will see that the accessibility and availability of water will become a far more important resource over the next decade or two. The same applies to energy consumption. So again, there's two charts there. It's clear that this is the International Energy Agency source. Again, the world is already consuming a huge amount of energy. So currently we're consuming 12,852,000 megatons equivalent of energy a year. And this is going to increase further by over a third in the next 20 years. As you can see in the left-hand chart, the OECD countries are going to be leveling out, or are leveling out at the moment. China is going to be increasingly energy hungry over the next 20 years. India energy increase will also follow, and other OECD, non-OECD countries in Africa show a slightly lesser increase. Now, what that means in terms of the types of industries is equally concerning. If you look at the right-hand side, where this growth of energy is going to come from by type of fuel, oil will continue to play an important role. So will gas and coal. So as you can see, fossil fuels are continuing to contribute the vast majority of energy sources, certainly over the next 15 or 20 years. Nuclear has some increase, and there's some increase in hydro and renewables, but not nearly to the extent that we would expect in terms of what is the art of the possible and what technology is currently available to actually drive that. And to some extent, that is driven by subsidies. And again, renewable energy, and this is hydro and renewables in general, so far are equating to about 66 billions worth of subsidies around the world, compared with fossil fuel subsidies of 409 billion, which is a completely different ballpark. Now, the good news is, of course, that Joe Biden, the president-elect in the United States, is a supporter of the Paris Climate Protocol and will rejoin that. So there is hope that actually the fossil fuel industry in America will be diverted slightly more into renewables. But as they say, the proof is in the eating of the pudding. Right. This is oil now and deforestation, another issue about where the world is consuming itself. This is a chart by BP, and on the left-hand side, which effectively is an old one. This is a 2009 chart, and but I think it's just useful to see in terms of the big users of energy in the world. And if anything, I would imagine that China, the bubble for China, has significantly increased over that decade. However, in 2009, the daily oil consumption was 13,356,000,000 liters daily. And that has increased over the last 10 years to 15,987,000,000 liters a day in 2019. So our oil consumption is still increasing, and our oil reliance continues into the 21st century. So the other noting point is that in terms of the red bubble on the left-hand side, the US, less than 5% of the world population consume over 20% of oil, which actually is a staggering amount. And you probably put China and America together, and nowadays you get to probably a third of the world oil usage. On the right-hand side, we have the state of the forests. And again, that chart is somewhat out of date, but I've updated the current state of play. And what is clear is that whilst the deforestation has not increased, has increased from the 1990 to 2000 levels. They have now stabilized around the 2010 levels. Now that in itself, though, is still a huge loss of rainforests. And we lose still 5.2 million hectares each year, which is the size of a country the size of Costa Rica. As I said, the levels have stabilized, but in terms of primary tropical rainforests, we are losing 3.4 million hectares still a year, and that doesn't count other forests, so European and Asian forests. Now you will see that Europe is and China are the only two areas that are actually reforestating, whereas the rest of the world you still encounter a significant deforestation. Okay, we come to climate change, and I think this is going to be an interesting graph to explore. On the left-hand side, you might not see this. I will actually send out these slides after this to the participants of this talk. But this is key messages from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, and it talks about an increase of man-made increase in temperature, world temperature, since pre-industrialization levels of 1.1 degrees. It talks about the oceans absorbing huge amount of CO2, which to some extent is a positive, but it actually leads to the acidification of the ocean, and therefore the future release of CO2, and obviously impacts the ocean wildlife and fish stocks. So those are the key messages. In terms of what I wanted to share with you is that the world is choking itself. In terms of the CO2 levels, so CO2 parts per million, measured in Hawaii on Mauna Loa Observatory. I want to show you the left-hand side graph, which showed where the part per million level was in 1960. When you get to sort of the 1990s and the Kyoto Protocol, we've reached 360, and the increase is continuing. We're now sort of heading towards 420 parts per million of CO2, and which is way above the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change recommendation in terms of what is sustainable. The belief was that anything over 380 parts per million is going to lead to a runaway climate effect. And as you can see on the right-hand graph, even the most recent trends over the last 3 years, we are trending upwards to unsustainable levels. And that kind of situation is presented in terms of what that actually means in terms of average warming, in terms of centigrade. Now that is in itself a key issue that the IPCC is measuring on an annual basis. Very negatively and depressingly, I suppose, that most people now don't talk about actually being able to sustain global warming below 2 centigrades, which is the line on the right-hand side here at the bottom. And the predictions, again, are not very positive. So if based on the Paris pledges, so this is the Paris Accord, the mean temperature of the planet is looking to increase by 2.7 centigrades by the year 2100. Now this is obviously without the US. In fact, actually, that figure includes the US, but who actually came out under Trump from the Accord and are now back, hopefully, and will join once more. But if we only follow existing policies, and I think the current state of play is that the Paris Accord has not been delivered, then the average mean temperatures are 3.6 degrees Celsius. And if we don't do anything and we just carry on our own merry way as we have done, then the impact is 4.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So these are the climatic impacts of pollution. And clearly, The reason why I mentioned pollution here is because there's a big impact of corporates, businesses, agriculture in terms of driving some of the climate change. So I want to show you another slide, which hopefully will put all of this in context, because at the moment we're really only looking at figures of, degrees warming, and that in itself doesn't really tell the full story. So this next graph is very busy, but I'm trying to talk you through it. 1 second, it seems to be, here we go. So again, this has been produced by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. And this is the impacts that we can expect globally in various dimensions in terms of the supply of water, which we've covered in the previous slide, the impact on ecosystems, impacts on food supplies, the reshaping of coastlines, as well as the results that these factors have on health and the more frequent occurrence of singular events. So I've put here 3 vertical lines. The first one is if we sustained the Paris Accord, what the various governments around the world had said we would deliver. We would still expect a 2.7 degrees Celsius rise in temperatures. And what would that mean? That would mean an impact on decreasing water availability and droughts of 1.1 to 3.2 billion cubic meters. The ecosystems, in terms of the ocean's acidification, would be accelerated. Food would be decreasing in lower latitudes, and the coastline, we would expect more storms, floods, and 30% loss in coastal wetlands. Which is significant, and then the associated health and singular events in terms of storms as well. Now, if we went forward to the next scenario, we would exacerbate this basically, and actually find further increases in all cereals, all food supplies, reducing in availability. And particularly in the low latitude regions. We would also find that 40% of the world's ecosystem would be affected, and likewise the coastline would be reshaped around the planet, particularly with melting in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And then if we did absolutely nothing, that would be the nightmare scenario that the IPCC has outlined, where actually we would be reshaping the planet in terms of its coastline, and a significant swathe of agricultural land would be unsustainable in terms of future farming. So this is a useful graph to bear in mind as we compare different scenarios in terms of global warming, because global warming is really only the symptom. The impact of this needs to be understood in terms of water supplies, ecosystems, food shortages, water flooding, and impacts on health. Okay, the fifth factor that I sort of highlighted in terms of why business needs to change is relating to income and wealth inequality. On the left-hand side is a chart of the Gini coefficient, and the Gini coefficient, income inequality, is a factor that is measured between income concentration, and it runs between 0 and 1. And these figures here at the bottom you should read as 0.2, 0.25, 0.3, etc., rather than 20, 25, 30. If the Gini coefficient is 1, it effectively means that all income in a particular country is vested in one individual. 1. If it's 0, it is completely equally distributed across the population. So effectively, the further you go to the right on the left-hand chart, the more unequal a particular country is. Now, in this particular chart, and it depends on the country, sometimes it's South Africa, this time here it's Mexico, has a Gini coefficient of 0.447, something like that, and is seen as the most unequal country in terms of income in the world. I've highlighted United Kingdom there with a Gini coefficient of about 0.33 and the OECD 30 average of just over 0.3. Now, income is one factor which is important. On the right-hand side is also the wealth distribution in the UK. And again, it's very easy to see that actually the evidence is that the vast majority, the medium income wealth is something like £205,000 in the UK, but it scales up from the medium to the sort of 70th and 90th percentile, leading to the top 1% of the population having a wealth of 2.6 million or more. On the other side, on the bottom of that graph, on the left-hand side, there's a significant amount of money. 1.6% of population have a negative wealth, and actually 1% of the population has a negative wealth of more than 4,000 or 3,860 pounds. So again, the bottom 10% have 1/100th of the wealth of the 90th percentile, and negative wealth is increasing as debts continue to grow. So, this chart is probably 2 or 3 years old, and the situation, if anything, has actually deteriorated rather than improved. Okay, and then the final reason why business needs to change is the impact of multinationals. And this is a graph produced by the World Bank, again, a few years ago. So, maybe Apple is now actually probably the sort of highest market capitalization and revenue organization, rather than Walmart. But what is interesting here, what the World Bank has done is actually provide a list of 100 countries and corporations, comparing government GDP, not the total country GDP, but government-related GDP, to corporate revenues. And that's in US dollars billions. So as you can see on the chart, what not immediately apparent, but 69, so more than 2/3 of the representatives here are actually corporates rather than countries. And as you can see on the left-hand side, Walmart comes in at number 10 with revenues of 482 billion US dollars, which is effectively bigger than countries such as Spain, Australia, Netherlands, South Korea, etc. And the list goes on. So I think the point I'm making is that these multinationals wield such power, such economic power, and increasingly also political power, that it is important that these multinationals adopt a much more inclusive role, not just focusing on terms of revenue and market share and profitability expansion, but actually participation and contribution to the countries in which they operate. Now, the key notion of multinationals is that they span international borders. So they're not privy to just one governmental legal environment, but they can choose where they want to be. And clearly, they've been in the press a lot recently in terms of their tax arrangements, etc. I don't want to dwell on that. I think the point I'm trying to make is that they will increasingly play an important part in terms of how the political, ecological, and social development will unfold in different industries, but also in different societies. And the key lesson, I suppose, I want you to take away from the whole lecture is that actually business is part of the overall ecosystem in which it operates. And therefore, the role business needs to play is beyond just focusing on revenue growth and profitability growth as binary measures of success. Okay, so those were the reasons why business needs to change in terms of how currently the business world, global business, and the global national, social, and political scenario is unfolding in front of us. But I also wanted to give you some ideas in terms of how what could be different and how we could approach things differently rather than just leave you with lots of why things need to change. And this is to some extent a summary of this. And I want to just dwell on this a little while. And that is that a business is not a separate entity that sits outside the social, political, economic, and environmental ecosystem in which it operates. Uh, Most businesses don't see themselves as such because the binary measures of profitability, market share, and revenue growth are the key determinants. The what I would like to posit is that actually taking a different attitude and actually having a much more balanced and integrated view of success as a business will yield fruits for the company, but also for the community in which it serves. And the reason why I'm using the United Nations quote here, because I think it's a much better description of a business, an organization, than maximizing shareholder value, for example. So the United Nations definition of a organization is a company's delivery of long-term value in financial, social, environmental, and ethical terms. And I think the definition of value is value to the whole ecosystem. So the marketplace in which it operates, the workplace in terms of how it relates to its employees and staff, the community in which it serves and contributes value to, and then the way it does it in terms of environmental impacts, and also how it deals with other stakeholders such as governments, NGOs, banks, etc. And these are really responsibilities that the businesses have. Now, what is clear is that some organizations take this more seriously than others. And I think it is now a requirement of every company of a certain size to actually have a social responsibility statement. Now, my own personal experience in terms of consultancy is that sometimes these are creations for the annual accounts. These are creations in terms of marketing and promotion, but they're very rarely ever fully integrated into the business processes themselves. There are some exceptions, and some companies are better than others, but they are by far the minority. So the message here is one of the things that business needs to consider is a much broader and balanced factors of key performance indicators, which extend far beyond the usual binary measures of financial returns. And the reason why I'm saying this is because a measure of success should be something, it should be an activity that you do to actually drive value, as the United Nations quote says, rather than focusing on output measures such as profit, market share, and revenue. These are the outcomes of the work you do. If an organization, a business, only takes these measures, such as optimizing, maximizing profit, there is nothing the organization ostensibly would not do to maximize profit or revenue or market share. That's why balanced measures, input measures, in terms of activities that increase and provide value across the value chain are significantly important and necessary to drive different outcomes. Okay, so when I said I didn't want to use build slides because it always goes wrong, the last two, I think I've looked to provide some examples in terms of what that could look like. Okay, so in the first place, in the marketplace, one of the key observations I would make is that corporate debt, corporate non-financial and financial debt, is soaring, is increasing, and actually is accounting for 50% of global debt or thereabouts. And the way we look at business market capitalization is also gone awry. For example, if I asked you a question, I know you can't respond right during the presentation, but we may cover it in the Q&A. What is the UK retailer with the highest market capitalization? You know, you would have said normally Tesco, but no, Ocado is now the highest market capitalized retailer in the UK, despite the fact that it has a fraction of the reach, bandwidth, or retail estate of Tesco, because market capitalization isn't just based on the present, but also on the future potential. How, however, Ocado can have reached such a rating, which is based not on equity, but purely on future potential, is a difficult thing to understand for most retailers. We've already talked about balanced scorecards. I think that's really important, but not just scorecards, but actually organizations really actually assessing their performance on a balanced basis. In my time as a consultant, I've come across various balanced scorecards, but when push came to shove, the only measures that actually meant something tended to be binary measures, such as outcome measures, such as profitability and revenue. And the third aspect I want to highlight in terms of the marketplace, the organization and its environment, are sustainable supply chains. Now, these are things that are being developed, and we've had a lecture on the fragility and importance of supply chains very recently at the BLSI. So again, please go to the Virtual Brilsey YouTube channel, where we now have something like approaching 100 videos on various topics, including business and economics, at least a dozen of those, to have a look at the importance of this element. And now clearly what is important here is that organizations take responsibility for their supply chain and understand where their partners are sourcing the raw materials from, how they're being manufactured, under what conditions, etc. So there's a straight through and transparent view of all the activities that take part in the supply chain. So those are three examples in terms of how to do things differently. In terms of the workplace, it is clear currently that actually the government has taken the unprecedented steps to support both businesses and employees in a way that hasn't really occurred in living memory. And this is the furlough scheme, or the business support scheme, or the work support scheme as was. And you know, the government is effectively currently employing probably something like between a third and half of the UK population, which is huge and extremely expensive. But what the point I'm trying to make here is there are notions. So really, I suppose a furlough scheme plus universal credits, etc., you know, is sort of hinging more or less on the concept of a universal basic income. The idea that actually there is a responsibility on behalf of developed or developing nations to actually look after its citizens and actually provide a sustainable way of life. It comes back to the United Nations statement. And I think the United Nations has evaluated this to be in the region of about $20,000 to $25,000 equivalent. So again, this is something that I think will need to happen in the near future. Likewise, the relationships that employers have with their staff in terms of employee ownership schemes, again, is an opportunity for the future, both in terms of engaging people in their business and actually driving more value for society as a whole. Coming back to McGregor theory, X and Y, people don't just come to work for money, they come to work because of the self-esteem that this affords them and the value they believe they add to the organization. And the final point here is one of zero-hour contracts, which again is prevalent in society, and there's been a lot of discussion in terms of the benefit and the scourge of zero-hour contracts. And I suppose for me, it's neither inherently bad or beneficial. I think the sort of chart from Denmark here, for example, suggests that actually it should be a mutual agreement uh, which is formed between the employee and the employer. So if it suits the employee on the basis that they have diverse business interests, work for different companies at different times, and they like the flexibility of that contract, I think that's a win-win situation. However, if they're being imposed as by the employer, then and the employee relies on only that job, then clearly that's an unsustainable situation for the future. On the environment, I think renewable energy, and we've talked about that. We're not investing enough in renewable energies. There's insufficient subsidies for renewable energy, and even the McKinsey report in terms of future technology investments actually doesn't see sufficient profit from the investment in renewable energy and prefers investment in other things like autonomous vehicles, mobile data, etc., as a more revenue rich in the next 5 to 10 years. I think that's a mistake, and I think renewable energy needs to be on the table for businesses to adopt. Carbon neutrality is another one where most businesses are grasping the nettle. However, there's a lot of greenwashing going on, where lots of businesses buying carbon credits to purport that they are going to be carbon neutral, and rather than actually taking positive steps to do the same. And then the final one is to reduce water wastage. And in the slide that I've already shown you previously, most of the extra demand for water in the next 15 to 20 years is actually coming from industry and from agriculture. So being energy and water efficient are key areas that businesses need to consider as part of their raison d'etre as a business. And then finally, the community. This is about actually being integrated into the local community, actually having people like customer panels, customer boards to actually inform the direction of the future in organizations, actually being part of the community in terms of provision of infrastructure in health services, education, etc., and also social housing, for example, in terms of new schemes. Now, the government has introduced various factors for social housing as for any development over a certain size. But again, as it stands, the developer could buy that out rather than actually comply with the percentages. So there's some way to go. So I hope that's been helpful and useful for everybody. I'm just going to summarize now the sort of key things and my concluding messages in terms of why business and possibly how business can be different. And then we go to the Q&A. Right, so first of all, businesses should integrate activities within their local and national and international communities rather than operate distinct from them in the country. The next one is develop diverse and balanced KPIs that extend beyond the usual binary measures of profit and revenue. Businesses need to focus increasingly more on partnerships in value chains rather than supplier relationships in order to build sustainable and ongoing relationships, and also understanding and being far more transparent across the goings on throughout their value chain. Again, we talked about market capitalizations. I think businesses need to reevaluate corporate valuations and the debt as a mechanism of funding growth, which I propose should be much more equity driven, equity by the company, not equity finance, to actually be sustainable. Improve resource and energy management in terms of water, energy supply, energy usage, and so on. And invest in sustainable technology, which, as I said before, is not really investing in future potential. its investment is still in the near future. So mobile data, autonomous vehicles are sort of some of the most recent suggestions from McKinsey. I think longer term investments are required. And that brings me back to the final point, is that actually it is really important for businesses to develop a more long-term view and also long-term employment. The current average tenure of a chief executive of a FTSE 100 company is somewhere between 15 and 18 months. And, with that kind of short-term employment, it's very difficult to see how a long-term plan can be developed for a business and actually being executed properly. That doesn't mean you just have to stick to a 5-year plan and implement it regardless. I think it's important to have an agile approach, a approach where you test different markets at the same time and use safe to fail experiments rather than just experimenting with one potential future solution. Those are the things that I would recommend for business to consider more earnestly with more urgency. And I hope that this has been a very helpful presentation for you, a lecture. And I now look forward to a really interactive Q&A session, because I think that's what makes these lectures, is actually the discussion afterwards. So thank you very much for your attention. Right. Good. Let me just see whether I've got any questions in the chat room. For any of you who would like to unmute and show your screen, this is the time to do it. And then we can get started with the questions. Okay, Duncan, I'm not sure whether you're clapping or you've got a question, but I take it it's a question.
It's in the chat box, everybody.
Okay. Thank you.
Surely your account of the world economic and environmental disasters bears no relation to your beliefs about business evolution. My experience tells me that the chief stumbling block to any kind of business change lies with lower management and workers who will resist change unless driven by charismatic strategies, which are very often in very, very low supply.
Okay. Is that an observation, or do you want me to comment?
The first part is a question, and that is, what's the why do these, what I would call neo-Ricardan, Sraffa-esque moral value type vision, why does it arise directly out of a disaster when in fact it's valid in itself? Well, disaster or no disaster, this kind of utopia is surely a very good thing.
No,
anyway.
So I agree with you. I think the idea of a utopia where businesses are operating in a way that is more in balance and in conjunction with the markets and communities it serves, I think is evidently a good thing. And I think having charismatic leadership in terms of highlighting and painting such a vision for the future is also very positive. I'm not sure though, Duncan, about your comment about workers being reluctant to follow that sort of charismatic vision of the future.
Let me sum it up. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. And in 10 years' time, if I'm still with it, still on live, I will probably tell you that. Because the point is basically that the literature of management is full of attempts to account for business change. Again and again, they talk about the problem of business change. Now, it's not going to be any different. According to Cohen and Cohen, the psychologists, when people experience disaster, they actually cling to their previous introverted habits.
Yeah.
What you're going to have is a mass of unhappy workers.
Yeah. Okay. So
managers are going to try and inspire.
Yeah. No, okay. So I think what you're saying is that under stress, people are going to revert to type and want to be trying to sort of row back to the shore of security, and rather than actually facilitate change. Yes, possibly, but I think it depends on the leadership of that organization. I don't mean the CEO, but the leadership within the organization in terms of the direction it sets for the business, in terms of its involvement in society and how the business can and should contribute. I mean, this is nothing new. I mean, you know, we're going back to the Quakers there, and you know, in the Midlands you had Bourneville, Cadbury's, where you know the idea of creating communities around your business is something that's been going for the last 200
The
years.
origin of the cooperative movement as well.
Yeah,
I agree.
yeah. And part ownership by employees, John Lewis Partnership, etc. You know, these are not new ideas. It's just that these ideas are seen as fringe companies, fringe ideas, etc., rather than actually something that is necessary as we hurtled throughout the 21st century. So thank you, Duncan, for your contribution. Anybody else?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Hi. Thank you for an interesting and detailed exposition. One of the things that strikes me is that you want to rebuild or change, in a better way, capitalism. And it seems to me that you have a problem in doing that. You've chosen, because if you want to change capitalism, on the one hand, you've got global corporations who are global. But on the other hand, you've got local firms that are local.
Yeah.
And to change the global firms, you need global acquiescence to this new philosophy. Just as in climate change, whereas China is building coal-fired power stations as fast as they can turn them out, they may in the future do something about climate change, but at the same time, this country is in a way going the opposite way of, so there has to be some common agreement in these broad themes that you are describing. I see that as a problem. For a local organization like the UK, that may be not a problem. But if the country is linked into the global business world, then it may be an issue.
No, that's absolutely true. My brother, for example, is a CEO of a multinational retailer, and you know, his slogan for his organization is "Think global, act local." So I think that's, you know, that's the kind of idea where you need to have a global view of the future, but you need to enact it. So it's a bit like a concept and a context, isn't it? So you must have a concept in terms of what your business ethos should be like and could be like to actually deliver value in the broader sense other than revenue and profit. But you need to have a different way of doing and implementing that depending on the needs of your local market. And I think it's that freedom that multinational companies could, or in my view, should afford their localities, individual countries, or even regions within that, that would make a big difference. And I think those countries who have gone down the route of having more community-based activities, you know, for example, some of the Central European countries, they've done quite well. And even industries which were perceived to be very centralized, things like energy, are actually finding themselves actually community type of energy is actually a good way of generating future energy needs in a different way.
So is this a politically driven solution that you're looking for, or is this going to be a business driven solution?
No, I think we are beyond the point of it being politically driven, because the multinationals are not privy to any particular legislation. They can move their operations quite quickly to other economies under different scheme. I think what I try to point out in the presentation is that there is an opportunity for even multinational corporations to actually realize the benefit of operating on a basis beyond the binary output success measures that they're currently operating under.
Yeah.
And I think government imposition would actually do the opposite. If a particular government imposed these things, the multinationals would just take up stick and leave and go somewhere else where the regime would be different. So I think we're fast getting to the point of, well, my personal opinion is that actually we are getting to the stage past the national state into much more of a global situation, because all the existential threats are global, and therefore they need to be dealt with on a global basis. Governments don't seem to be able to agree on anything, and the UN hasn't got any teeth to speak of, despite the lovely sentence I read out in terms of what business should be doing. I'm more hopeful that actually an integrated business approach of what it means to be a successful business is a better way of going forward.
Thank you. Yeah.
Anybody else? Let me just scan down.
Your concluding slide.
Yeah.
When I looked at that, all of the elements added together, that was China. That's it. I mean, what you want is the United Nations to become the new China and to get everybody added together. It's going to be very peaceful. It's going to look, you know, Xi Jinping will go on forever. And there's no competition. I mean, the way business has changed in the last 20 or 30 years has been through Walmart, who has completely changed the way of approaching business, Amazon.com, Apple. This is how change has Toyota has really come to the fore and improved things. We want to get rid of all that and get government to sit on everybody and make them nice citizens and don't do business, look after social events, etc. I think the Russians tried this. I thought we learned the lesson in 1989. I know Putin wants to do it again, but you know, it's.
Yeah. I think what you're saying, I'm not proposing communism or socialism here.
I think you are.
Well, we just need.
Business looks after the communities. That's communism. Business should look after business. That's what Friedman said. Milton.
Yes. Okay. What I'm saying, Tony, is that business needs to have a broader view in terms of what success looks like. Yeah, because it will actually drive better results both for the organization and the environment. So I'm not looking at some sort of gulag. I'm not looking at some sort of top enforced edict from politically or otherwise. What I'm looking at is actually a realization by business itself that there is a different way of doing business. And that's what I'm proposing. I'm happy with capitalism. I mean, the idea of creating a surplus is absolutely right. It's the distribution of the surplus that I think can be more effective and guarantee the longer term growth of an organization rather than the short-termism that we see. We had the gentleman from the Institute of Directors come to talk to us about short-termism. And I think the problem I see isn't so much as to whether it's capitalism or socialism. You know, they're just different forms of governance. What I'm really looking at is that if you're making decisions based on very basic output measures rather than input measures, and you're actually doing this with a timescale in mind of less than 12 months return on some of these investments, you are going to make the wrong decisions. But you're making those decisions because you're a CEO of a multinational company who's only going to be at that company for between 15 to 18 months. So therefore, you are not interested in the 5-year deliverable, the strategic plan. You're interested in returning shareholder value as soon as possible over your tenure. And that, I think, is the wrong way to go about it.
I think most CEOs that I've worked with are more conscious about the competition eating their lunch rather than all that you just spoke about. The CEOs are responding to the market and trying to keep the business going. Not that they're just sitting there to see out their time. So you live in a different world, I must say, than I.
No, that's fine, and I think it's always good to live in different worlds, Tony.
Yeah,
so
it's fine. Yeah,
that's okay. What I would say though is they're not sitting there just eking out their time, but what I'm saying is they're making decisions based on deliverables that can be seen, can be judged during their tenure. And therefore, that's their primary concern. And therefore, that's what they're going to be concentrating on. Anyway, let's just agree to disagree, Tony.
I think customer comes first, and that's what they're concerned about, not shareholders, customers. If they don't, they lose. Nevertheless, carry on. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
No, that's good. I think, that's what I'm proposing. I think, a customer-facing business will be successful rather than an output measure-driven one. That's absolutely right. So I agree with you on that.
Yeah. Well, I agree.
Good, Duncan.
Good.
Excellent. Well, this is quite animated. I'm enjoying this because this isn't about right or wrong. This is about exploring different things. So, who else would like to ask a question? I've got Diana is asking, what are core resources? Well, core resources are sort of raw resources. It could be rare earth metals. It could be things like lithium. It could be wheat. It could be food supplies. It could be grain. It could be oil, etc. Those are the kind of raw resources, fine earth metals, rare resources, etc. that I'm talking about. And obviously, oil, as I pointed out, is something that we will be relying on, according to the Energy Agency, for quite a way to come. And we're not really exploring, or we're not implementing renewable energy sufficiently quickly. Okay. Then Duncan says minerals. Minerals, yeah, that's true. And let me just go through. There's 12 more messages. Sure, who's this? Let me have a look. Oh, Duncan, you've got another question. Do you want to raise this one? Surely your account of the world economic and environmental disaster bears no relation to your beliefs about business evolution. Okay,
well, I've done that already, really. What I've just put on is a defense of you against you being a commie. You're not a communist. I think what you're suggesting is a new approach to consumerism.
Yeah.
And consumerism is genuinely based upon need.
Yeah.
But my doubts are, how are you going to get the frightened populace of our workforce to come alongside? I mean, the big men, they'll change it overnight. The big striders in the world, they want to be seen as idealists.
Yeah.
Then they've got to talk to their sub-managers, and it doesn't work. That's the major problem in any business change.
Yeah, well, I suppose, for me, it's I've always found employees who have been given something compelling, something that they can actually believe in and get to grips with, being quite happy to do that. I think, the relationship between employers and employees is probably something that needs to be mended somewhat. And I think, we've been suffering from that for a while. And in a previous lecture that I've given, it's a employee used to be effectively a member of the family, and part of that organization, and mostly for life, or maybe having one or two jobs. Nowadays, it's much more interchangeable. It's much more of a mechanistic approach between the employer and the employee. Transactional, I would say. And I think that's the kind of thing, if you haven't got a compelling vision, if you can't engage and motivate people to actually do the right thing, which they know what the right thing is, then you've got a problem. But I think you're fighting really with your own history of industrial relations that needs to be put right. Okay, I've got something from Anna. Does the speaker feel optimistic about these goals being A, achievable, and B, realistic in terms of take-up? Well, we've covered some of that. So I'm an optimist, naturally. So I think we are going to find that the next generation is more aware and more involved in thinking about the overall commercial ecosystem than we are. And I think they're getting already fed up with the current economic situation that's been put into stark relief as part of the pandemic. I've got 4 boys, and two of them are currently graduated and looking for jobs still. And I can tell you, the employment market is not good at the moment, and what's on offer is not good either. And you know, they're graduates with no experience, and they're fighting with people for entry-level jobs, let's say in marketing, against people who've been in the industry for something like 10 to 20 years, are heads of marketing, applying for entry-level roles at the moment. So that's not positive. But I think the younger generation are more aware of how these different economic, political, social, and environmental factors sit together. There's much more outcry on things like fast fashion, on sustainable supply chains, in terms of employment contracts, etc. I think my idea for the future is more positive in terms of the next generation, in terms of how they're going to be applying it. But I think ultimately, and this is the negative part of it, ultimately, people will only change in sufficient volume and numbers because they have to. So it will be because of a burning platform that they're standing on that they will change ultimately in sufficient numbers. And that burning platform could be a whole host of things. I think it's going to be climate change, but it could be other things like artificial intelligence and so on. But I think climate change is going to be unfolding quite quickly over the next 20 years, which is basically the next generation's career path, and they will have to tackle that, and they will have to do things differently in order for businesses to thrive. So I hope that was useful, Anna. Yeah. And then I've got Robin. You mentioned the huge subsidies to fossil fuels at a time when we are trying to move to renewables. Do you have any information on who is paying these subsidies and to whom? No, not as far as the presentation that I've just given you. I mean, it's certainly something that we need to look at. I could have shown you actually, let me see whether I can show that slide. Let me just see, because I think that's quite interesting in itself. Okay, is it going to work? Yeah. Can you all see that? Yeah. So this is the McKinsey. This is the McKinsey report I talked about. So this is their projections over the next 5 to 10 years, 5 years or so, in terms of what will drive value in the global economy. Okay. And as you can see, you know, invest in mobile internet, which is quite interesting. I worked with several of the leading mobile telephone brands in the UK. So EE, T-Mobile, Orange, and O2. And, you know, they've been trying to monetize data for the last 15 years. And but even now, McKinsey suggests that actually this is where the money is going forward. Then there's automation of knowledge at work. You know, so this is big. So, you know, Google has got a role to play. The Internet of Things in terms of interactivity and connectivity, cloud technology, and advanced robotics. And then a little bit of autonomous and near autonomous vehicles. So that's the sort of latest state of play in terms of McKinsey's projections in terms of what's going to drive value. All the useful stuff, things like next generation genomics. So this is CRISPR-Cas9, sorry, gene editing, for example. That's quite low on the side. Things like 3D printing, advanced materials, but also advanced oil and gas exploration and renewable energy is seen at the bottom end in terms of actually driving value. Now that is again quite a short-term view of the world without really understanding the implications of not doing something on the health and environment related activities in terms of driving value. That's McKinsey. So, you know, as far as McKinsey is concerned, as long as it's sort of robotics that increase productivity, if it's more about big data and it's more about mobile internet, which facilitates things like 5G and autonomous vehicles, then really that's what you should invest your money in.
Can I comment on the subsidies in the fossil fuel area? Yeah. that number has been used and brought about through the UN or something, I forget which now. But for example, in Venezuela, prior to the current collapse in Venezuela, the price of gasoline was about 10p a gallon.
Yeah.
And the subsidy of that, from the government subsidizing gasoline down to 10p a gallon for all Venezuelans, was counted as a subsidy to the oil industry. Of course, it's not. It's a subsidy to the people. In Indonesia, it's the same thing. Subsidies to fossil fuel products for making them cheaper for their populations to use. That adds up to that 406 billion. It's completely different from the subsidies to windmills and solar, which is a subsidy to the business. The business would not run as uneconomic, wouldn't work without the subsidies.
Okay.
The oil industry works and pays massive taxes all over the place. But the subsidies that are in that 406 billion are actually subsidies to people to buy the oil industry products in countries which make a lot of other stuff. I'll leave it there and look it up when you get home. You'll find out that game has long ago been shown to be bogus.
Yeah. Okay, but I think the Tony, that's right, and you know I don't know where that subsidy is from.
I
So
leave it there. You check it out. One thing, can I just make one other comment? I don't want to dominate. I don't want to, but I was surprised in your description of shortages going to arise and everything from the environment to oil to everything else. You didn't mention the Kayla identity. Are you familiar with the Kayla identity?
No, I'm not.
It's the multiplication of GDP plus amount of energy per person, and what it really comes to the conclusion of every time is you've got to get rid of people, right? That's the only thing that will save the planet and everything, to get rid of people. Now that's happening. In 50 years' time, no one will speak Italian. They'll all have disappeared. Germany will be the end of the century. There'll be no more Germans. They're not breeding, right?
Well, okay. Well, let me just interrupt, because Tony, population growth has been an issue ever since Malthus, and Malthus predicted we won't be able to feed the planet, and because you know, technology advances won't be big enough, and population increases geometrically, and technology arithmetically. So there's an issue. Obviously, you know, we're still here, and there's much more of us. You know, we had about 1 billion at the time of Malthus in the planet. We've now got something like nearly 8 billion, and they're still there. However, that is, the population isn't going to fall in terms of by 2100. The average prediction by the UN, I think they've got a low case of some 9.6 billion by the end of the century.
Right.
They've got a midpoint of 11.2 billion, and they've got a high estimate of 14.6 billion. So that would be doubled more or less from where we were a few years ago. So I think the population is going to increase, and I think that predominantly, but not just in the developing world, where the replacement ratio, i.e. the number of kids born to families, is actually decreasing, but actually will increase in the developed world. And I think one of the biggest increases you're going to see is actually in America, predicted to be the increase in population. So we are definitely not decreasing according to the different projections in terms of world population, and that's something that we need to cater for in terms of the economy of the future. So thank you, Tony. Good. Well, listen. Oh, Ian, please.
Yeah. Can I just come in quickly on the on this subsidy to energy thing? And there was a fascinating chart by Jeremy Warner in the Daily Telegraph, which is not a particularly eco-friendly newspaper, which pointed out in the last 10 years, and this is before the American election, that the market capitalization of Exxon had halved, and NextEra, which is a Florida-based renewables company, is now worth more than Exxon, and that Ørsted is actually now worth more than BP. Ørsted, who operate the Hornsea wind farm in the North Sea, the Danish company. Yeah. So capital is being totally allocated away from oil and gas and going to renewables. And that will, in the long term, I mean, oil and renewables share prices are just sustained by the fact that they pay big dividends, which is fine, but they've got no money for capital investment. So they're dogs.
Yeah, okay. I think that's, but it's a bit like the example I gave about Tesco and Ocado. You know, market capitalization is not the same as your revenues and your equity base. So market capitalization is a valuation of your organization that is based on either its current performance and likely future performance, or actually, which is increasingly with the renewable industry, is the future potential. Now, I'm not saying that that is right. I'm a digital dinosaur. I existed before Google. My digital experience predates the birth of Google. So I've seen the dot-com bubbles coming to go, and we've got the same applying again in terms of disruptive technologies and distribution systems like Ocado, and the same is happening in the renewable energy. You know, some of these companies aren't going to survive in the renewable space, but they're still being valued on the basis of unrealistic future potential. So I agree with you. You know, it doesn't just work one way against the oil industry and not the other. I think, you know, we need to have a better way of actually evaluating the worth of organizations and businesses for the long term. And the green bubble is the next thing to burst.
But I don't think the companies in the renewable area, such as Ørsted or even SSE and companies like that, are on crazy valuations. I mean, SSE develops assets that can sell them off at good prices.
Yep.
You know, the people who can't raise any capital are the oil companies.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's certainly well, because exploration is becoming more difficult.
Yeah, the stranded assets.
Yeah. So, you know, it becomes increasingly more difficult. You know, Mr. Trump didn't get his way to drill in the Arctic, and he didn't manage to buy Greenland, where he was going to dig next. So there's, you know, getting into economic way of retrieving oil is getting more difficult. Now, listen, we are fast approaching the watershed, so we've got a couple of minutes left. Maybe for one final questions. I'm sorry that I haven't been able to follow the chat room as much, but I'm doing everything myself today. I'm introducing, I'm presenting, and I'm trying to do the chat room all at the same time. So please bear with me.
Let's just say that your account of our current disasters was menacing but absolutely brilliant.
Well, thank you, Duncan.
It's a formidable synthesis,
yeah,
coming from all sorts of different directions. I've put down something now about what I would call tautonomy, and this is the fact that against McKinsey, the market in the future is going to be more and more driven by moral rather than idiotic things like labor theory of value or something like that. And it's what the big thing is going to be is, do we follow what we call a Walrasian voting system, in which basically, I think somebody said this already, I think it was Demo, you know, what's going to happen in future is that the consumer is going to decide. And what we need to oppose, I think, is the idea that, you know, we need a new martial aid. I think that would be a very destructive approach.
Yeah.
You know, basically, they're going to bargain. They're going to bargain for what they want.
Well, I think the idea is that I think your comment earlier, Duncan, was there's a difference between consumer need and consumer want.
Yes.
And I think that's going to play itself out over the next 10, 12 years, you know, and I think that's because of various factors, whether it's availability of resources, whether it's attitudinal changes in society, which will sort of underpin a different way of thinking. I mean, I think this generation are thinking about what's important to them slightly differently to what people did in the past. Okay, well, listen.
Okay, can I just make the relevant comment of the night, and that is that Ricardo actually wrote his book because his wife went to the bath in Bath, and he wrote it on the pages of The Wealth of Nations. So Ricardo and economics began in Bath.
Well, there you go. And despite the fact that we're obviously broadcasting globally now in this digital world of Zoom, it's good to see that it all came from Bath, leading it back to Bath. Thank you, Duncan. And finally, I think just from Svetlana, she's saying that A radical change will be possible once we are able to critically re-examine dominant values and truths. So I think that is, it's not going to happen without doing that. You know, we need to recalibrate, and that was the message I tried to send. And hopefully that's been helpful. I think just in closing, thank you, Chrissy. Just in closing, I'll just let you know about next month. Next month, we're going to have a talk about professional development and contextual intelligence. So this is very different. So this is obviously much more aligned to the current predicament that most people find themselves in the job market, and actually what it takes to build a meaningful career, and also how to potentially get a new career, and the importance of contextual intelligence in that process. So I hope you're going to join me for that in December. And in the meantime, I wish you all the very best of health. Stay safe, and increasingly stay sane. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Andreas.
Bye-bye.